Should you prune tomatoes? Always, sometimes, or never? That's what this one's about. Coming up. So these tomato plants that I grew, they weren't the Barry Bonds type of tomato plants. They weren't big and jacked with a lot of production to follow that big and jacked look. They were more like David Boston of the San Diego Chargers circa 2003, or Bruce Seldon, the boxer who faced Mike Tyson in the 1990s. They looked the game, but they couldn't really play the game. These tomato plants grew really massive and big, yet I had very little fruit and I had a lot of disease. Not that pruning would have solved the whole disease problem, but I think it would have helped. So let's take a look at my thoughts on pruning based upon not pruning last year after I was challenging my belief of always pruning. So when it comes to pruning, why do you prune in the first place? Let's address that. You might prune for a few reasons. You might prune given the cultural practices that you're trying to establish. If you're in a greenhouse situation doing extreme lower and lean, you probably want to prune the fruit so you can continue to lower and lean. If you're opening up the fruit to increase airflow, if you're trying to reduce the cluster size on some fruit clusters to get bigger tomatoes or more tomatoes, there's a reason for that. If you think it's going to help with disease production, there's a reason for that. If you're pruning for space, there's a reason for that. So before you do any pruning of your tomatoes this year in 2020, think about, why are you actually pruning in the first place? Now, I don't want to go as far as saying you should always prune, but I think always pruning should be the default. And if you're not going to do that, you really need to think about why you're not going to do that. One common argument I hear to pruning is, well, my grandpa or grandma never pruned and they had huge tomato plants with a lot of fruit. And I would say, well, maybe that's the case, but that really has never been my experience, or really the experience I've seen in a lot of gardens and farms that I visited. A big plant doesn't necessarily mean big fruit production. It might just mean a big plant, meaning a lot of greenery at the expense of fruit production. And remember, it's the David Boston or Bruce Seldon. It looks the part, but it doesn't really give you what you want. You want the Barry Bonds plants, the ones that look robust, they're tall, they're strong, maybe they're doping, but at least you're getting production out of them at the end of the day. So if you're clinging to this idea of not pruning, why might you not want to prune? What are the advantages of not pruning? Well, one, it's a lot less work, and I mean a lot less work. Having to prune a number of tomato plants, sometimes multiple times a week during the course of a season, can be a job in and of itself. It's not always the most fun job. In fact, it's one of those jobs, it's maybe fun the first 2 times you do it, but after that it gets old pretty quick, and a few weeks into the tomato season, you're kind of like, why am I doing all this pruning, or why did I plant all these tomatoes? This isn't what I wanted. So not pruning saves you work, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of canners and seed growers don't prune their tomato plants when they're growing them out in the field. They don't want to spend all the time and labor to prune those plants. They just let them sprawl out over the ground. Appearance isn't really a thing. They're just out for the most amount of tomatoes for any given amount of work put in. And field tomatoes that you just let sprawl everywhere and you just harvest whatever you want, well, easy work for some production. It works for seed producers, it works for canners, and I guess it could work for you. So one not pruning strategy might be, you just plant a bunch of tomato plants, let them go, and whatever you get is whatever you get. That being said, if you're out for a certain quantity of tomatoes, you're going to have to do some mental math or estimating to say, okay, I'm probably going to need to overplant to get that much production out of these plants, knowing that any given plant isn't going to produce as much as it might if I was pruning. Now, if you are going to be doing some pruning, it doesn't have to be a job in and of itself. On one hand, you have lazy no pruning, and on the other hand, you have intensive tomato culture like you see in hothouses and on market farms. They're doing that for a reason. The lazy gardener is doing that for a reason. If you want to live somewhere in the middle zone, how can we prune a little bit and get the benefits of pruning without the negatives of pruning, meaning all the work involved? If you're in that middle ground, there's a few things I would do. One, I would do a hard starter prune. Remove all the lower foliage off the plant and get it away from the ground. That's going to prevent a lot of dirt from splashing up, transferring soil-borne pathogens onto the plant, and it's also going to open up the bottom of the plant to allow airflow to come in, to flow under the plant, removing some of the moist conditions that a lot of diseases like blight love, and downy mildew and powdery mildew love. After that, it's just going to be a bit of maintenance pruning. By maintenance pruning, we're just going to remove the suckers as they appear. What's a sucker? Well, anytime you see the main stem coming off like that, and then you have another leaf coming out, and you see that little one sticking out right here, this is the sucker. This is the one you want to cut off. Do it sooner than later. You always want to prune smaller parts of the plant versus big, thick parts of the plant. It's much easier for a plant to heal a tiny little wound than it is to heal a big wound. So prune those suckers early and often. The other part of maintenance pruning is just kind of pruning for your space. Think about where you're growing these. If you have aisles and pathways, prune it back. Get those branches out of the aisles. If there's plants brushing up against each other, you probably want to open up some space. If you happen to plant them too close, like I did, you want to get some airflow going between them, so prune them back to let airflow in. And as plants are sending out all these leaders, that's the main stems, they're constantly trying to send out new leaders. If you let a sucker grow, it turns into a new leader. If the plants are getting too tall and too wild and they just look super bushy, but you're not seeing enough fruit production, try cutting back on some of the growth by pruning off some of those leaders. Now, you may hear market gardeners talking about things like hard pruning, where they remove all of the foliage below the lowest fruit cluster. That's extreme, and they do that for a good reason. I'm not saying that is bad at all. I'm not also saying that is good either. I'm just saying if you're living in that in-between zone of trying to get the biggest bang for your buck without the most work, you don't want to be taking on hard pruning, because hard pruning in the wrong conditions can lead to sun scald on your fruit and actually damage the plant, because you might remove too much foliage, so it's not generating enough energy to keep growing and producing fruit. So you want that kind of balanced plant where you are checking its growth and yet stimulating fruit production in the process. And I once heard this from an old timer, that he said that when a plant gets pruned, it thinks it's dying, so it wants to reproduce. It puts out flowers and it's trying to set fruit. I don't know if that's true. I tried to look up some studies on that. I couldn't find anything about it, but logistically, logically, it makes sense to me. So pruning could stimulate fruit growth, and I can't find any studies that says pruning increases the amount of fruit production per tomato plant. So you really got to think about this one. Are you doing it because somebody said you should do it? Are you doing it because you've always done it? Or are you doing whatever you are doing, pruning or not, because you've really thought about what you're trying to get out of it? So in addition to balancing out the plant, you're also doing something else. You're allowing increased airflow within the plant itself. If you think about tomatoes grown in the field with no season extension, meaning we're not involving caterpillar tunnels or high tunnels, we're not growing these in greenhouses, we're growing them literally under the sun. You don't have a lot of switches to flip to really control that plant and how that plant responds to disease. When you don't have a lot of factors to really help prevent disease, you got to use the ones you have to work with. Pruning is one way to help lessen the disease pressure on your tomato plants. You're not going to make a plant immune to something like blight or mildew by pruning, but what you're doing with pruning is you are removing some of the conditions that those diseases need to thrive. Too wet, stale, stagnant, and moist of an environment generally leads to problems with tomatoes. So by pruning back some of the foliage, letting air come through there, letting some of that moisture dissipate, removing some of that canopy that's trapping air in between the ground and the plant, could help reduce disease pressure. I am saying could there, and I am emphasizing could there, for a reason. I have tried to dig up studies, and I have done a lot of research before I made this video to try and find any study that says pruning reduces disease pressure in tomatoes, and I can't find any. If you can find one, link to it in the comments below, because after a lot of scouring, I couldn't find one. So anybody that says pruning reduces disease pressure is kind of guessing, kind of assuming, and kind of exaggerating. It might be true, but we don't know it is for sure true. The one thing we do know is for sure true is pruning helps remove some of the conditions that diseases that attack tomatoes need to thrive. It doesn't make them immune to those diseases, it just removes the conditions that they need to thrive in the first place. The other thing that can really help with pruning and access is birds. I remember sitting on my deck last year looking out at my tomato plants, and I saw a lot of birds flying into the tomatoes, pulling out worms and caterpillars that had landed on those plants. If you can kind of open up your jungle that is the tomato forest to allow birds to come in there, that could be beneficial for you. It also helps you see fruit. It helps you notice damage. If there's gopher damage or squirrels or rats getting in there, you're going to see that a lot more if there's less foliage hiding those plants. So just from a far standpoint, sitting back, looking out at your tomatoes, being able to actually see what's happening from a distance and from close up is obviously going to be easier if there is less foliage versus more. So I think that's another reason why you should consider pruning some. If you're not going to prune, great. Take it easy. Put in some extra plants, give them a ton of space, and enjoy your fruit throughout the summer. If you are going to prune, then keep it simple, stupid. Use the KISS method. Prune early, right when you put the plants in, a nice hard starter prune, and then just do some basic maintenance pruning to remove suckers, to control the plant size, and to keep access and visibility good. That's as hard as it has to be. And that's actually pretty darn easy. Now, I know this is going to be a controversial subject. I know there are diehards in both camps, the prune and the not prune camp. So let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are and why you think what you think. Don't just tell me, well, I always prune and I get good results. Well, how are you pruning and why do you think pruning is leading to those good results? Or I never prune and I get a ton of fruit. Well, why don't you ever prune? And what is a ton of fruit? And have you tried pruning? And have you shown to yourself that not pruning is actually better? Let's start trying to answer these questions a little bit more scientifically and experimentally in our own lives, in our own situations. You know, try two plants. I'm not going to prune one. I'm going to prune the other. Which one's going to do better? They're right next to each other. They're the same variety. Do these type of tests and leave comments below. I would love to hear more about them. I may try this on my property again this year, doing some side-by-side comparisons. Plant A, not pruned. Plant B, pruned. Which one's going to do better? Regardless of whether you prune or you don't prune, enjoy tomato season. I think it's something to look forward to given everything that's going on right now. Find some good varieties if you can still find seeds. Get them started, get them into the ground, have a plan going into it. Don't decide on the fly. And as always, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.